Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on investing in the digital future of nonprofits. I'm Louise James from Accenture, and it's fantastic to be joined here today by a fantastic panel. Lauren Woodman, CEO of NetHope, and Jake Porway, the CEO of DataKind. And we were part of the panel this morning here at the World Economic Forum as part of the initiative that the WEF has on partnering with civil society on the fourth industrial revolution. And that's really because we know how crucial digital transformation is for the sector. So before we get into some of the key messages that came out of the panel today, Laura, maybe a bit of context from you about what you see as the opportunity for digital transformation in the sector.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you for hosting this conversation and the session this morning. I thought it was a very good panel, and I think it highlighted a lot of the opportunities that we have. There's so much work that needs to be done in the humanitarian development and conservation space, which is what we particularly care about, but certainly all across civil society. And the opportunities for technology to accelerate that work, to give us some greater insights so that the interventions that we design will actually be more impactful, and the opportunity to bring together civil society with the communities that they serve, with one another, with national governments, with the private sector, to partner and really learn from one another so that as we continue to move forward, as the digital economy and all things digital really take a foothold in civil society, that we are bringing the best of what each of us has to bear through those partnerships, through that work together, and through that collaboration, so that the benefits that we know will be there can actually come to fruition.
And I think one of the things we talked about today is the challenge around investment, actually, and that was why we specifically wanted to have that as the title of the session, that we feel that a lot of nonprofits are behind the curve in terms of digital transformation, and part of the reason for that is trying to get the investment into their digital capabilities. So yeah, Jake, any thoughts on that point about how we actually get the resources in the sector?
Yeah, well, I think there were a lot of great points that came up on the panel today. And I think we're at a kind of a watershed moment for getting kind of a new thinking about how multi-stakeholder partnerships could get more funding and investment into the space. Certainly, so at DataKind, we operate kind of like a Doctors Without Borders for data geeks. And so we'll team up technologists that volunteer with NGOs and say, hey, here's some short-term capacity. And that's been all well and good for the past 5 or 6 years. I think we've seen lots of other examples of companies and others volunteering that time. But I think what we're starting to see now is that people don't just want innovation capital. That's the exciting capital to give. Foundations love giving it. Companies love giving it. We all want to build a cool new AI thing. But increasingly, as people seem to understand what it takes to be digitally native, there's I think a stronger call for data infrastructure funding, having a data science team that does some of the less sexy but maybe higher impact operational needs. And so I think there's a new opportunity for both the companies and foundations, even governments who want to support this digital transformation, to put investment into not just starting a project, but thinking what about the long-term life cycle of a data team might look like. So I think that's a new opportunity that we haven't had before, and where we're headed and need to go. And I think the challenge would be figuring out how to do that in a way that really attracts the right talent and maintains that talent.
Yeah, and that talent point, right, came up a few times about saying actually the sector struggles in terms of retaining data scientists, and we talked a bit about what we can do to retain talent. But yeah, Lauren, what did you take away from those discussions?
Yeah, I think you've highlighted one of the important points that really came out of this morning. And building on your comments, Jake, it's part of it is the challenge around building capacity across the organization for all of the areas in which there is opportunity. Data science is a huge one, right? When we think about AI and the ability to collect and analyze data well and learn from that, huge area where we just don't have the right talent. We can't retain that talent. But you made an excellent point around, it's not just the deep sciences stuff. It's also the technical capacity, the digital capacity, the ability to fluidly use applications and apply technology that organizations also struggle with. And I think, Jake, you're right. There is this opportunity that donors are beginning to see, it's not just the innovation funding. It is the sustained, ongoing organizational change, organizational support, capacity building resources that are needed. And there's some very forward-looking funders that are out there that are really tackling that. But I also was really inspired to hear people talking about sharing, using opportunities like DataKind, using some of these unique examples that we heard coming out of Brazil around trading essentially college education for a commitment to work and bring that expertise to an organization. So I think that in combination with this new realization around investment and the need for those dollars, there's also new models that are popping up that I expect we'll see being widely taken up because the need is so great.
And you mentioned this morning, Lauren, the point that the tech is the easy part, right? It's the people, it's the culture, it's the organizational change around that. And I think we heard a lot about that. So we had some great case studies this morning about really demonstrating the impact, right, of digital on social impact. What stood out for you, Jake, as a great example?
Yeah, well, I go back to the one that pops to mind is one that we worked on because it's easiest to come to mind. But it was a case where a community college was working to understand how they could get folks to graduate more effectively. It's really important as we talk about here at WEF, economic growth and opportunity. Getting folks the education they need to be productive is a big piece of that. And one of the challenges this college was facing was that they had a below 50% graduation rate from seniors who were so close to graduating, but just weren't making it through. And so there were teams that put together algorithms that looked at the data around students, not just at GPA, not just at attendance, but really kind of subtle patterns like how their credit patterns changed to identify folks that were at risk of dropping out, at which point the student services would step in and say, hey, did you know you're almost done? You could finish if we just helped you through this last part. And the students sort of woke up and said, oh, that's great, I didn't even realize. And in a year, they got their graduation rates up to 73%. Very straight ahead kind of, operational change. If you're looking for the whiz bang of AI, it doesn't sound that kind of, frontier, but I think it's incredibly powerful and incredibly new. And that's clearly a model that I think many other organizations could adopt who have similar challenges.
Yeah. So. And I think sometimes it is simple, right? We have to demystify digital. People think, oh, it's this scary thing. Actually, we all use it in our everyday lives. And Lauren, what stood out for you as a great case study this morning?
Well, there were so many, but I think the one that struck me, and it really brought together a number of themes that I've heard throughout this week, was this example that around using AI to measure children to identify stunting.
And that was Kate Hampton from SIF.
Kate Hampton from SIF. And talking about the ability to use photos and AI and make some determinations there, because human error sometimes in the field didn't always catch the cases that we needed to catch, and the monitoring was insufficient if we relied only on human intervention. And I think that combination, right, of making sure that we're in communities, we're working in communities, but we're also relying on technologies to get to the most precise, most insightful impact that we can have, was a really interesting example to me of using data, its real life applications, involving the community, and then being able to identify where resources are most needed.
And we touched on the leave no one behind agenda, right? I think that was a great question around how are we making sure that we're making technologies accessible, and that we're actually bringing in that whole leave no one behind agenda, which I think is absolutely critical. I'm going to ask you for your one key takeaway in a minute, but before I do that, we did touch on ethics, and I think that came up quite a bit. What did you take away from that discussion?
Yeah, it's a conversation that's on everyone's mind and is rich and complex, ranging from everything from, we're going to talk about data privacy and how we might think about the data folks are collecting from vulnerable populations. Kate also mentioned that a lot of the NGOs she works with are being attacked, cyber attacks now, so data security is going to be a big deal. The one point that I often come back to is when we talk about the ethics of technology, we often think about it in the box of technology. But it seems that the real opportunity to create ethical tech is to have that kind of accountability loop. So I think thinking intentionally about who either at an NGO or in the space can say, yes, that algorithm is creating the equitable outcomes we want, and if not, we can change it or modify it, is really the key to creating ethical tech, because we can do as much as we can on the lab bench to try to make this thing, remove bias or use the right data, but there's always stuff that's going to change, and I think that's a really powerful opportunity to be supported and funded.
Absolutely. Lauren, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the ethics question is one that we will continue to struggle with for a long time. There are no easy answers, as you rightly point out. And I think the depth of conversations that you hear, not only here this week, but over the last couple of years around the ethics, recognize that we need to have a lot more conversations until we get to consensus. But two things that sort of stuck out to me, and you touched on it, was it's not just a simple question of ethics. It's also the capacity inside organizations to identify where there are risks, and that those conversations need to happen up front as technology usage is ramping up, because the unintended consequences that you mentioned, we may not be able to foresee them, but if we are purposeful at the front end of considering different outcomes, then we may mitigate some of the unintended bad decisions that get made. And your point around being able to adjust those algorithms and the data science and the analytics over time also speaks to the capacity problem.
That's a great point.
So it's not just the technical capacity that we really need to build, but it's also all of the other things that sort of play into this around the ethics questions of, are we aware of that? Are we asking the right questions? And if we do need to make a change, do we have the ability to do so?
Yeah, great. So one final key takeaway from this morning's session. Jake.
Oh, dang.
I can see both looking away. Go, don't pick me.
I think we need some really forward-thinking funders, like Lauren mentioned, to be willing to make long-term investments and investments in infrastructure and stay for the long haul. We have been doing some work with the Rockefeller Foundation and MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, and I think they have taken a really kind of forward-looking view to say, what would it take not just to do more projects, but to get data science embedded in the social sector? And they're trying a number of approaches. And at DataKind, we're trying these kind of sector level approaches to saying where are the opportunities for a space. But that's just one example. I think you could have almost venture funds to help carry on the individual prototypes to actually make sure they work and scale out. So whatever form that takes, from capacity building to prototypes, I think the long-term commitment from companies and funders will be a big change.
Yeah, absolutely. Lauren, top that.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know that I can. But the thing that I would add to that I walked away from this morning was a sense of optimism, and a sense of optimism that, we've had lots of high-level discussions for many years about the potential of technology in this space and improving the work that civil society does. What I took away from this morning is, that is really beginning to move into some very concrete work. The depth of the work that is happening, even in pilots that we now need to move to scale, is really quite impressive. And I got a real sense of urgency from everyone sitting in the room, donors, funders, private sector, civil society, public sector, everyone saying, now we need to move from the promise to the power of technology and really seeing those benefits realized, because we almost know enough right at this point in time to really begin making some big strides.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you, for sharing your insights from this morning, and look forward to continue working with you on the WEF initiative. And for those of you that are watching, if you look on the WEF's website and look up the work on partnering with civil society on the fourth IR, you'll find lots of resources there, and also talk about the different working groups that the WEF has on this topic. Thanks for watching.